Sponsored by the James Madison Council and the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Welcome to the 2021 National Book Festival. I'm Eric Deggans, media analyst and TV critic for National Public Radio, and I'm here with Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award winner Annette Gordon-Reed, author of On Juneteenth. Thanks for joining us for this special virtual version of the book festival. So, Annette, I want to start this out by talking a little bit about the theme of the book festival. The theme this year is Open a Book, Open the World. And so I'll just ask, how have books opened the world for you?
Well, it began when I was a child. I grew up in a very small town, and I spent lots of time in an even smaller town where my grandmother and grandparents lived, and we visited them sometimes in the summer and usually on the weekends. And I read books. It was the thing to do. After you've played enough and you've run out of all the things that could be done in rural East Texas, I would go inside and read books so I could discover new worlds in those books. And it took me outside of that very, very provincial area. So it opened the world to me, actually and literally.
And it's interesting because, we're hopefully emerging from this global pandemic, another situation where people have been forced to be in somewhat closed down, limited settings. I wonder if your relationship with books changed at all or evolved at all during the pandemic.
Well, it pretty much continued. It was a way of seeing what was going on in the outside world. It was a way of taking your mind off of the things that were going on right outside. I was here in Manhattan, which was for a time ground zero of the pandemic, and not live, near Central Park. And I could see when we went on walks, I could see the tents, the makeshift tents that had been put up for people who were the overflow from the hospital. So it was an opportunity to look in books, history books mainly, and discover a new world.
I hear you. Yeah, especially when the regular world gets to be too much.
Exactly.
Exactly. So as we tape this, Juneteenth is coming up in about 3 weeks.
Hmm.
We're about a day from the end of the 1 year anniversary of George Floyd's death, and we're a few days before the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Hmm.
I mean, it feels like the weight of America's history of oppressing Black people is really falling down hard on us at about this time.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering, what should people be thinking about as these anniversaries roll around? And what can they learn about the importance of these anniversaries from your book on Juneteenth?
Well, I think what I think people can learn from it, and what I take from it is that African American people have been on a journey from, literally again, crossing the ocean into slavery, out of slavery. Juneteenth is a hopeful time when people at the epicenter of all of that down in Galveston learned that there would be no more slavery in Texas, and they had hopes and they were happy about all of this. And we know that their hopes were not totally realized. It took many, many years to realize those, and we're still trying to realize them. The things that have happened recently, the murder of George Floyd, all of those things, interested in thinking about voter suppression, all of those issues are part of this struggle, this journey that we have been on. So it's triumph in the sense of commemorating the hopes of a group of people in one place, but the things that you've mentioned remind us that we still have a long way to go and we're still on that journey. So I think it's the notion of a continuous struggle is what these anniversaries bring to mind to me.
It's interesting. So I read the New York Times review of On Juneteenth, and it said that this was an unexpected book, I think referencing the idea that your previous work had kind of been about not being that personal about history. And
Mhm,
here you write a book that's entirely personal about
mhm.
history. Can you talk a little bit about, does it seem that way to you, number one? And why did you decide to take this different tack, if so, with you on Juneteenth?
Well, it is unexpected. I mean, I write about the past but I write about other people's lives in the past. Jefferson, the Hemingses, slavery as an institution, and I'm not as personal in my writing. But this is the kind of writing that I've always wanted to do, a kind of writing that I always wanted to do. And my editor has been after me for a number of years to do a book about Texas and to write about Texas history, but with a sort of personal slant to it because he knows that I grew up in Texas. And I thought that this was an opportune moment to sort of turn the focus on myself to a degree. I mean, it's still a history book, but to talk about how history influences individual people's lives. I mean, we think about history and we think about people who were famous or people who were politicians or people who took actions that changed society, but in some we're all a part of history. We can tell the history of a time through our family stories. And I wanted to talk about Texas and the history of Texas, speaking of this issue of race and how this has influenced that the development of that state in ways that people don't typically think of Texas in that way because the image of Texas is one of the West, and they don't think about the sweep of American history and race relations in Texas because people don't think of it as a part of the South, which it was a part of the South. It's the Southwest, but it was the Eastern Texas is a plantation society. So I wanted to try to open up a little bit and make it personal in ways that I think young people might relate to. I mean, we like to read about one another, and this is it's a book that I think is accessible and will get people thinking about their own families and to think about their families in terms of not just what happened to them as individuals, but as a part of history. We're all a part of history, and we can tell that story through our family lives.
I love, I mean, there's so much about this book that I love and I want to get to talking about, but I love the way you talk about how sort of our drive to see the American story in maybe the best terms or the most heroic terms winds up distorting the history that we are taught or that we remember. I've often said that, people in general, but Americans especially want to be the heroes of their own story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we wind up changing the details sometimes when we remember the history to kind of play it up. And so, how do we sort of fully understand Juneteenth, especially as a commemoration and what it stands for, when we're sort of facing the weight of this attempt to whitewash history and make America seem more heroic than maybe it was in the past?
Mhm. Well, I think you have to keep the people in mind, the people who heard this news. Uh, Actually, the grapevine, however you want to call it, people knew in Galveston before General Granger got there, what he was going to say and what was likely to happen. So there was some forewarning about all of this. But to think about this moment when people learn that legalized chattel slavery is over. And I think to be true to their hopes, we can't lie about what happened. We can't pretend that the Texas Republic did not come into existence as a slaveholders republic. I mean, we think about the United States Constitution and the American Declaration of Independence, but let's think about the Constitution. The Constitution protected slavery, but they were reticent about it, and they were talking about persons held to service, and it's clear what they mean, and it does protect slavery. The Texas Constitution has no bones about this. I mean, it's clear they wanted to be upfront about it. This is, slavery is going to be protected. African American people can't come here unless there's permission from the state to come here, and we know we're not going to give that to many people. And they can't be citizens. So what do you do? What do you do with that reality? You can't pretend that it's not there. And I think you're not doing a service to the people who were oppressed, who lived under this system of slavery during this time period, if you don't tell the truth about what they had to face. And because the thing is, it's clear. My father used to joke every time we had these celebrations, he would be the really sarcastic one and say, the slaves haven't been freed yet. I mean, he knew that
Yeah.
slavery was over, but what he meant was it was a struggle. It was going to be, there were still things were not right. And I think you do a disservice to them if you hide the magnitude of what they faced, because the people didn't give up. I mean, there was celebration during that time period, but there are instances, accounts of people who were whipped for celebrating.
Celebrating.
They celebrated their freedom, and the whites who had been their former enslavers were hostile about this and were upset. And you understand that this was their way of life. They had depended upon the institution of slavery, and slavery, which is why it's still important for us to talk about this. People wonder, why are you still talking about these things? But slavery created a racial hierarchy.
Yeah.
And it told people how Black people were supposed to be treated, how the privileges that white people had. And you just can't erase that. No
Nope.
day, no Juneteenth, no day, July 4th, whatever day you want to call, can get rid of what that meant for generations. The people who
Well,
came to Texas who settled there came from other slave societies. So, we have to keep these things in mind if you want to be true to the hopes that those people who endured, so that we could be here we have to be faithful to them.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk in the book about being a child and trying to understand, like, why do white people hate Black people so much?
Mhm.
And once you understand that there's this whole economic imperative to the racial hierarchy in America, it explains a lot of things that just seem crazy if you don't realize that's what's going on.
Mhm. Well, it's an economic imperative, but it's also it's a behavioral, it's a psychic need as well, to be able to look down on someone. To even certainly in Texas and other parts of the South. I'm not saying something that hasn't been said many, many times before, but poor whites and Black people had much in common. But many poor whites could never get over the racial part of that, to see those possible areas of commonality, because they were above African American people on the hierarchy. And for some people, that's more important than money. And it doesn't, economists like to think of people being as rational actors, but I guess the behavioral economists know now that that's not the case. But,
Exactly.
you know, it means a lot to be able to say, I'm not at the bottom here. Even if I'm poor, even if I don't have very much, at least I'm not Black.
It's interesting too because, like, I read the part of your book where you talk about the depictions of the Alamo,
Mhm, mhm.
and I was thinking about being a kid myself and watching those movies, and cheering for the Americans and hoping that they would win, even though at the end they don't, and not realizing that I'm cheering for people who want Texas to be independent so it can still have slavery. And it's like, you know, um, excising that part of the story from our popular notions of history is that another example of that, trying to preserve America's heroism while not acknowledging the true roots of this stuff. And your book talks about
Yeah, yeah. Imagine what it's like to be a Texan. I mean, we take Texas history twice, fourth grade and seventh grade, and that story features prominently. And it's a story that takes on, it's about valor, it's about loyalty, it's about things that are important that you want people to think of, to honor. Those kinds of things are important. But you think about what it is that they're fighting for here. Um, Santa Anna had suspended the Constitution. I mean, slavery is at the heart of all of this, but there were other things at the heart of it as well. But you think about this, and how do you square that? How do you celebrate, or do you celebrate the honor? Do you celebrate the people who are standing for their principles? When you examine their principles and they're things that are anathema to you, what do you do with that? How do you process it? And I suppose what it means, and right now, I'm sure right now there's a huge controversy down in Texas about this, about whether or not people should be allowed to teach, to talk about race, to talk about white supremacy and all those kinds of things. what it means is you have to just have a more mature attitude about history and the
Right.
people in history, the good things that they do and the bad things that they do, but you have to have it all, the whole story there. And it's like finding out that, people, your parents or aren't perfect in a way. Or even worse, find out people that you've admired believe things that would do you harm. You have to come to terms with that, and that's what it means to be an adult. You have to get beyond hero worship without any kind of real sense of the fact that you're looking at human beings.
Well, it's interesting. So you talk in your book about the dual histories that can emerge when you look back at periods like this. There's the accepted version that white people say in public, and then
Mhm,
there's the secret history that Black folks know that talk about that we talk about amongst ourselves. And
mhm.
I wonder, is on Juneteenth in some way an attempt to kind of unite those two histories? And what have you learned about the nature of history by exploring the idea that we do often have these two separate tracks, at least two separate tracks, when it
Mhm.
comes to some moments in history?
Well, it just reinforced for me from what I knew from my other work, but seeing it in a personal sense here of how you have to take you have to look at so many different sources to be able to get a clear picture of the past. There are documents, there are newspaper articles, there's oral history, there's family history, and all these things have to be brought together and checked against one another to get the right story, because you can't just go on the official story. I mean, there's an official story in every kind of situation, in many situations, that the people who are putting forward have their own interests, they have their own agenda, and they don't want people to know uh, aspects of the past that would cause them to be embarrassed, might cause their descendants to be embarrassed or whatever. And you have to realize that and recognize that there are other voices about the past. And so, I talk about the story of a man who was accused of raping a white woman
Mm,
and put on trial and eventually killed in the courthouse, as it turns out,
yeah.
with no repercussion for the person who murdered him. But my grandfather had always told me this story about this guy, and I didn't even know until I was working on the book that this case, which involved the suspect, the defendant being beaten until he confessed, went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And I'm a law, it's interesting. I've been teaching uh, criminal procedure and talking about the 14th Amendment and confessions and so forth. And I didn't know that this story that my grandfather had told me was a Supreme Court case until I did this. And I'm reading the records, and there's Livingston, there's Conroe, place of Livingston where I was born, Conroe where I grew up, and where this thing happened. And again, reinforcing this idea that history is all around us, but you really do have to. And my grandfather was the one who mentioned that, who said that in the Black community, it was thought that this man and this woman had an affair. He was Black and she was white. And when it was found out, it became a story of rape.
Mhm.
And so there's this folk knowledge about this, and the official records don't carry anything at all about that, don't say about that particular part of the context. So you have to look at all of these things and investigate.
That's amazing. And so when you're in a situation like that where you have a personal connection to the story that you're investigating,
Mhm.
does it feel any different as a historian when you're working on it as opposed to doing scholarship about Thomas Jefferson where you have some, distance from
Attachment.
it? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's different, but I would say it's a question of degree. Even whenever you're working on something, and for me, you have to really be hard with yourself and realistic with yourself about how you're responding to the information that you're gathering. Something will come along and you will think you might have a response to it. You might have a strong reaction to it. And then you have to stop yourself and say, why am I reacting this way? Why am I pausing over this particular subject? and this particular issue. So when you're doing these things, whether it's for a subject that's not close to you or a subject that is close to you, you have to be rigorous with yourself about your responses and to question, not just question the sources, which historians are supposed to question the sources and try find corroboration for things, but you also have to question yourself and watch your reactions to things. Why does it bother you that you hear a story about a man having an affair with someone, for example? I'm just picking this out of a hat. Well,
Sure.
why should I what stake do I have in that? Why do I want to say that I don't think it's true or whatever if there's evidence for it? So it's the process of questioning yourself has to go along with questioning the sources that you have, but you have to do more of that. I guess what I'm saying is when you're talking about yourself and things that I know that I'm close to, I'm talking about grandparents or mothers and fathers. You have to be even more rigorous in policing and considering the worth or the value of your responses, the nature of your responses, why you're responding a particular way.
Sure, sure. I mean, when you when you said, for example, that it was thought, black folks said that this guy was having an affair with a white woman. The thing that I thought to myself is, we have all these stories. The Tulsa Race Massacre supposedly started because a black man was unfairly accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. And we have all these examples in history of black folks getting lynched through unfair accusations. Like, what black man in his right mind would have an affair with a white woman, knowing the stakes if it was ever discovered? And so, like, my prejudice would be to even disbelieve that part of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that why what my grandfather would say is that this guy was stupid. I mean, that he didn't that he talked about it, he bragged about it,
Right.
and that was a thing that you shouldn't do. But you know that people don't always do what they're supposed to do.
They're
So,
not right.
so that is the thing, But the point of the story really is the fact that whether they were having an affair or not, whether he raped her or not, the Texas Rangers took him out. It's clear they took him out into the woods every night and tied him to a tree and beat him until he confessed. And
Right.
that was a violation of the United States Constitution's due process clause. And that's, you can't torture people for a confession. So yeah, the affair part of it is, is I don't know the answer to that. I'm just saying that those were two versions of things, but we
Right.
do know about the Texas Rangers, and we do know what happened, and we do know that the guy's the woman's husband shot him in the back of the head in the courtroom in front of the judge, the jury, everybody, and was acquitted. So that's the real story in it.
Exactly. So, so you write about integrating your town's elementary school as the first black child to go there. This was in Conroe.
Yes, in Conroe.
Yeah. So, but you didn't have any police protection or officials shielding you. We're used to these, we're used to these scenes of, the state police escorting people in. You didn't have any of that. And I've always thought, one of the saddest things about some of these stories about integrating schools is the pressure that it puts on children. The children
Yes.
have to go there.
Mhm.
And can you talk a little bit about what it was like to revisit that story? Did you discover things about it that maybe you didn't remember at the time? And what was it like to deal with that pressure
Mhm.
of integrating that school?
So what's it like to integrate a school? What was it when you're 6 years old?
Right.
Um, I had written something about this when I was cleaning out a closet after the book was done, and I found an essay that I had written. I don't know how, but it must have been a long time ago, judging from the courier type. It must have been a long time typeface. It must have been a long time ago about this, and it was curious to look at the differing, presentations, and the facts are basically the same. But I would say that there was a little bit of different emphasis this time around than the first time. What it was a lot of it was pressure filled. I my parents thought and the school district thought that it would be better if it were handled without a lot of fanfare. Apparently, I didn't find this out until later on. There had been threats against my family. There was hostility about this. But my father took me to school and dropped me off, and that was that. And there were people who were nice to me, and there were people, the teachers were wonderful.
Mm.
And I think, I don't wonder if, and it didn't occur to me until again after I finished writing the book, that maybe some of this was that my mother was a school teacher.
Mm.
And I wonder if there was not some sort of, camaraderie, that my teachers knew that this was the child of another teacher. But for whatever reason, my first grade teacher, Mrs. Daughtry, everybody remembers their first grade teacher, was wonderful to me. Some of the kids were nice, some of them weren't. I think some of their parents may have told them to make sure that they were friendly to me, or maybe they decided on their own. But some of them were hostile. Or there was the situation where people would be nice to me in school, but if I saw them in town
Right.
with their family and I spoke to them or was, made overtures or gestures, it would be like, who are you essentially? I mean,
Hmm.
and even then they knew these were kids, first grades, they knew how their parents felt about Black people.
Right.
And I guess they knew not to show too much friendliness, that they would get in trouble if
Right.
they did. So all of these things started me thinking about race and, you know, what this was all about from a very early age. I mean, I think that was probably uh, the biggest effect upon me, is that it made me wonder what this was all about and why things were like this. And what was it, as you mentioned before, what was it about us that made people feel that they had to carry on like that?
So you write in the book about feeling proprietary as a Texan about Juneteenth.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could explain to those of us who are not lucky enough to have been born and raised in Texas, like, what don't we get about Juneteenth? What will we learn about how we should feel or think about this holiday as a result of reading your book? Uh,
Mhm.
Educate us Yankees.
Well, us Yankees. Well, what I would hope you learn from it is I felt proprietary only for a short amount of time. This was in college when I discovered that there were other people celebrating it, and it was something that I had always thought of as a celebration for Black Texans. Then it became a state holiday, and so it was Black and white Texans, I suppose, celebrated. Now, what you could learn, I think, is that it was carried across the country by Texans who moved to these various places and brought the holiday with them. Well, I think that we're all connected, that it is a holiday for all of us because it is just another. There was no one emancipation, obviously. The emancipation, slavery ends legally with the ratification of the 13th Amendment and when it goes into effect December 31st, 1865. So that's the legal part of it. What Juneteenth was the result of the surrender, the final surrender of the Confederate Army. And then uh, Granger can go into Galveston and make this announcement. So what I hope everybody would think is that this is a holiday for everybody, but it sort of marks the progress of African American people, the struggle of African American people coming back to this is just another point on the journey. And it doesn't just belong to us, it belongs to all of us because our fortunes are linked together wherever we live, because we have the dealing with the legacy of slavery and we have dealt with the legacy or the reality of white supremacy in the country, no matter where we have lived. It's manifested itself in different ways, but we're still struggling against that.
So you talked a little bit, you referenced these ongoing discussions that are going on in Texas about, how much to talk about race in teaching history.
Yeah.
And, I could imagine a circumstance where someone might have to defend teaching your book in schools in Texas, curiously enough.
Yeah.
What would you say if you had to face a school board or
If I
a
had to,
legislature? and tell them why this book is important to be taught in the schools there.
And what would I say to a school board? The current, I guess it's the 1836 project that refers to the year Texas became a republic. What I have to tell them is that the truth is the truth, and there's no way to talk about Texas history. You can't even do the primary documents of the Texas Republic talks in several sections about race and about slavery. So you don't want to lie to children. You don't want to lie to young people about, because they're pretty savvy. They when they find this out, they're not going to appreciate. They will find this out somewhere. It's generally known. They go to college, other places. People know this, so you need to tell the truth. That's all I could say. And I talk in the book about the fact that I do love Texas, and I explain why I love Texas. That it's about family and family history, the experiences that I had there. Loving something doesn't mean that you have to think it's perfect. And it is a shallow, to my mind, sense of love and affection if you have to lie about it or have to hide things. So I would tell them that my book is all about talking about the reality of Texas, how it came into existence, the good points and the bad points, and that's a useful thing for students to know.
Makes sense. I gotta thank you so much for joining us for this discussion for the 2021 National Book Festival. Annette Gordon-Reed, author of On Juneteenth. And thank you, the folks who've been watching this, for joining us in this special virtual version of the National Book Festival. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you around. We'll see you at another panel discussion later on today.
Thank you very much.
We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and now we'd like you to hear more from the library's own experts on this topic.
Welcome to the Library of Congress, where I am joining you today from the beautiful Thomas Jefferson Building. My name is Michelle Crowell, and I am the Civil War and Reconstruction Specialist in the Manuscript Division. As historian Annette Gordon-Reed suggests in her book On Juneteenth, the journey to emancipation was a long one and involved countless individuals acting on local, state, and national levels. The start of the Civil War in April 1861 accelerated that activity as increasing numbers of enslaved persons escaped slavery and took refuge behind nearby Union military lines. This forced the U.S. government to formulate policies to address the status of these freed persons in ways that were consistent with military objectives and which the white Northern home front would support. Although Abraham Lincoln would later state that, quote, "if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," as president, he felt confined to act against slavery within constitutional bounds. As early as July 1862, he had drafted a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation using his position as Commander-in-Chief to declare that enslaved persons living in areas in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863 would, quote, "thenceforward and forever be free." While the wording of and provisions included in Lincoln's subsequent proclamations evolved, the central idea of emancipation remained. Fulfilling the promise of freedom in the Emancipation Proclamation, however, required Union military advancement within areas claimed by the Confederacy. Thus, the official announcement of the end of slavery in Texas did not occur until U.S. General Gordon Granger issued General Orders No. 3 in Galveston on June 19, 1865, which inspired later Juneteenth celebrations. The ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865 officially abolished slavery nationwide, but the debate over the meaning of freedom continued, and African Americans advocated vigorously for their rights of citizenship. In December 1865, for example, Black residents in South Carolina petitioned the United States Congress to urge that any new state government and constitution legally recognize their rights before the law. They specified voting rights as essential to this process, noting that, quote, "without this political privilege, we will have no security for our personal rights and no means to secure the blessings of our children." The names of more than 3,000 men followed that plea, creating a petition of 54 feet in length, which Senator Jacob Howard of Michigan introduced into the U.S. Senate on December 21, 1865. This petition is now preserved in the Justin S. Morrill Papers in the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress. You can find many resources relating to emancipation in the Civil War era by visiting us online at www.loc.gov.